David and his 17-year-old son had an absolutely horrifying encounter with a Sasquatch while hiking up to Mount Isolation in New Hampshire. But before we get into their encounter, welcome back to Dark Wilderness, where I share encounters with the unexplained. If you've had an encounter that you would like to share, please email me at the link below. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button, as I'll be uploading multiple times every week. So if you come out of your tent and you see an 11-foot Sasquatch in front of you, before you go sliding down a ravine, make sure you grab that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. This encounter comes from David, and it happened in 2020 while him and his 17-year-old son Tristan were hiking the Rocky Branch Trail out in White Mountain National Park in New Hampshire. The Rocky Branch Trail runs for about 18.2 miles. It takes about 9.5 to 10 hours to hike. However, most people will generally camp about halfway down this trail. It's located right in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, an absolutely remote and rugged wilderness. It's an area that David and his son went to quite often. They were very experienced backpackers, very experienced backcountry campers, and it was just something that they enjoyed to do together as a father and son bonding experience. They had been planning this trip for a couple of weeks. They had actually hiked the Rocky Branch Trail before. However, for this particular hike, they were going to do things a little bit different. Instead of launching at the North Trailhead, taking the trail all the way around to the South Trailhead, having David's wife pick them up and bring them back to his vehicle, they were actually going to be going from the North Trailhead, taking the trail to where the trail starts to turn south towards the South Trailhead, and from there they were going to go off trail heading northwest up towards Mount Isolation. They had never gone to Mount Isolation before, and it was something that both David and Tristan really wanted to do. And now that Tristan was 17 years old, David figured that he was big enough that he would be able to handle himself should something happen to him. So that's what they had planned to do for this particular trip. David had Friday off, so Friday morning, him and his son, they loaded all their gear into the truck, and then they made their drive all the way out to White Mountain Park. When they got to the North Trailhead, they kind of pulled all their gear out of the truck, just did a double take, just to make sure that they had everything they needed. Once they determined that, yes, they did have everything they needed, they put their packs on, and they started making their way down the trail. They walked for several hours, basically just talking and enjoying each other's company. They crossed the Rocky Branch River, and within a few hours, they were at that part of the trail where it turns south. When they got to that spot, they stopped, and they kind of started talking between them, just confirming that for sure that they did want to try making it to Mount Isolation. They had never done any off-trail hiking like that before, so this was their last chance to decide if they really want to proceed with this or not. After a couple minutes of talking, they decided, yeah, no, they for sure want to go to Mount Isolation. So they turned and they started heading off into the wilderness. When they got off trail, both David and Tristan realized that travel was a lot more difficult. Now, instead of walking along a nice green trail, they had to climb over fallen trees, go down into ravines, and climb ridges. By the time it was starting to get dark, they had only made it about a mile off the trail. David had looked up, saw the sky, saw that the sun was going down, so he called Tristan over to him, and he told his son that they needed to find a spot to set up camp, and they needed to do it now before it was dark. So they kind of branched off from each other, and they just went looking for a nice flat place where they could set up their camp. Tristan found a spot right at the top of this one ridge, so he called his dad over. So David walked up to where Tristan was, looked around, and determined that this was probably the best spot that they were going to be able to find to camp before it was dark. So together they dropped their packs and they got to setting up camp. Once the tent was set up, David told Tristan to get all their gear inside and to bring out the camp stove, some water, and some MREs, while he kind of made a little spot outside just to set up the camp stove so that he could heat up some water so that they can eat. So while he's outside clearing a little spot for the camp stove, he could hear Tristan inside the tent kind of rummaging through the bags. A couple seconds later, Tristan comes out of the tent. He has the camp stove, the MREs, some water, and he's also holding David's .45 in his hand. He looks at his dad and said, "Hey dad, why did you bring this?" David said to Tristan, "Well, we're in bear country, we're in the middle of nowhere, that's just some extra protection just in case." So David reached over, he actually took the .45 from Tristan first, put it on his hip, then he got to setting up the camp stove and getting some water boiling for food. By the time that they had started eating, it was full on dark outside, and about halfway through their meal, Tristan looked right at David, and he said, "Hey dad, why is it so quiet?" In that moment, David realized exactly how quiet the area was. He did not hear any crickets. He did not hear any other bugs. He heard nothing at all. And that put him pretty on edge. But he looked at his son and he said, generally when it goes quiet like this, generally that means there's a predator in the area. He said, so let's just finish eating, then we'll head into the tent and we're going to call it a night. Just as they were finishing eating their meal, they heard this loud crack come from the woods right behind the tent, followed by the sound of something very large moving through the woods. That made David even more on edge, so he put his hand on his pistol, stood up, went into the tent, and he came out a couple seconds later with a box of flares. He took one out, lit it, and he put it on a rock right beside where the camp stove was. He looked at Tristan and said, this should keep away any animals. Let's just head into the tent and let's just call it a night now. So the two guys, they made their way into the tent, and shortly after getting settled in, Tristan fell asleep, but David could not fall asleep, not yet. He needed to make sure that whatever that was gone. So he just kind of lied there for a little while, holding his pistol close, just listening to the woods, trying to see if he could hear any sign of whatever that was that moved around behind the tent. After determining that whatever that was long gone, David slowly drifted off to sleep. He was awoken a short time later by Tristan shaking him, saying, Dad, 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 there's something outside. So David's all groggy, he opens his eyes, kind of trying to figure out why his son's waking him up. And Tristan said to him, Dad, there's something outside the tent. He said, I could hear it breathing. I heard it rub up against the tent. So David looked at Tristan, told him to be quiet. And David just kind of sat there for a minute, just kind of listening to see if he could hear whatever this was that Tristan heard. After a few seconds, David noticed that there's definitely something outside the tent. He could hear it moving probably about 20 feet from the tent over towards where that flare had been. A few seconds later, they heard the sound of their camp stove being knocked over, followed by what David describes as a very deep grunt that he described as sounding like, whoa. And when he heard that, he had no idea what made that sound. So he grabbed his pistol and he made his way to the front of the tent. He unzipped it just enough to look outside, but he could not see anything because it was just way too dark. So he looked at Tristan and said, I'm going to go check it out. And Tristan said, I'm going with you. Dave kind of just gave his son a nod, unzipped the tent the rest of the way. And the two guys, they got out of the tent and they stood up. David instantly noticed that directly in front of him, about 20 feet away, right over top where their camp stove was this absolutely massive silhouette. But he could not see exactly what this was just because it was so dark. All of a sudden, from right beside him, he just hears followed by just a blinding light. And he noticed that Tristan was actually holding one of those flares out like this. As soon as that flare illuminated the area, both of them got a perfect look at this thing standing right in front of them. And David describes this thing as being an 11-foot tall Sasquatch covered in dark reddish brown hair. He said the color of the hair was kind of hard to make out because it was from the light of this flare. But he said it appeared to be a reddish brown. He said it was absolutely massive. Massive shoulders, massive arms, massive legs, and it was looking away from them. Almost instantly, this thing turned around and looked directly at these two guys. Both of them just kind of stood there staring right back at this Sasquatch. David didn't know what to do at this point. He knew he had to protect his son. He knew he had his pistol, but when he was looking at the sheer size of this thing, he knew that his .45 would likely not do anything to this Sasquatch. So they just stood there kind of in fear, staring back. This Sasquatch started to take a couple of steps towards them. And in that moment, David drew his .45 and he fired a shot into the ground, hoping that the bang would at least scare this thing away. However, in retaliation to that shot, this Sasquatch, David said, let out just an absolutely guttural scream. He could feel it resonate through his body. He reached over, grabbed Tristan's arm, pulled him, and told him to run. The two of them ran right for the top of the ridge, and they started sliding down the ridge itself. They slid for about 60 feet before they hit a big pile of deadfall timber, and as soon as they hit that, they climbed up over it, and they kind of used that as like a bunker to shield them from this Sasquatch. David said as soon as they climbed over these trees, he could hear the Sasquatch at the top of the ridge where their camp was, absolutely demolishing their camp. He could hear this thing screaming, grunting. He could hear the tent being ripped apart. He could hear things being thrown around. And when that started, he was just feared for him and his son's lives. They ended up spending the entire night hiding in this little deadfall pile of trees. And when the sun finally started to come up, David just abandoned all their gear, said to Tristan, "Let's run." And the two guys, they tried to run back to that main trail. When they hit the main trail, they sprinted like they have never run before. And David said that they covered so much ground so quick, he does not know how he managed to run that far. When they got back to their truck, both of them were just happy to be alive and happy that this ordeal was over. David's advice is if you're going backcountry camping, especially in a really remote area like where him and his son were, he said go in a bigger group, don't just go two people. And he said if you ever do come across one of these Sasquatches, he said that they're not intimidated by the sound of a gunshot. He said, so do not fire a shot thinking that you will scare these things away. He said that that gunshot just kind of triggered an anger response from this thing. He doesn't know exactly what would have happened if he would not have taken that shot, but he feels like that shot triggered more aggressiveness from this thing. So his advice again is just always go in bigger groups and just try not to intimidate these things if you come across them. Well, that's it for today's encounter. As always, thanks for joining us, and if you have any comments, please leave them in the comments below. And if you haven't done so already, if you come out of your tent and you see an 11-foot Sasquatch, before you go running and sliding down into a ravine, grab that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time. Today we have an absolutely frightening Sasquatch encounter that happened to Tim and three of his cousins up in northeastern Ontario in 2005. But before we get into their encounter, welcome back to Dark Wilderness. If you've had an encounter that you would like to share, please email me at the link below. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And before you go riding your bike down a dark gravel road, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. In 2005, Tim was just your typical 16-year-old kid. He enjoyed playing video games, hanging out with friends, riding his bike. He grew up in Guelph, Ontario, which is located just outside of Toronto. But his absolute favorite thing to do was to spend time up at the family cabin in Algonquin Provincial Park. Algonquin Provincial Park is located up in northeastern Ontario. It's absolutely rugged. It's incredibly hilly, full of lakes and rivers, dense bush. It's very similar to the Appalachians down in the US. Now, Tim's parents owned a cabin that was not a lakefront property. It was actually located just off the lake a little ways. But he also had a couple of aunts and uncles that had cabins out there as well. Now, his family, including his aunts and uncles and all of his cousins, they spent pretty much every weekend up at their cabins from spring all the way until fall. They would go up in the winter to do snowmobiling, snowshoeing, and cross-country skiing, but they would not typically go out to the cabin in the winter as much as they would through the nicer months. So that year at Thanksgiving, they were going to keep up with their family tradition, which was to head out to the cabin for the weekend. Now, Thanksgiving up here in Canada is typically usually around the middle or towards the end of October. It kind of changes a little bit every year. So by that time of year, the weather's already cooler, it gets dark a lot earlier, but they did what they typically did every time they would go out to the cabin. The Friday night, once his parents got off work, Tim, his mom and dad, along with his younger sister, they loaded up in the family van and they made the multiple-hour drive out to the cabin. By the time they got there, it was already full-on dark, but Tim did what he did every time they got out there regardless. He got out of the van, went over to the shed, grabbed his bike, and then he went riding around the development trying to see if his cousins had come out yet. He ended up linking up with a bunch of his cousins, and they spent the rest of the night just kind of riding around, talking, just kind of enjoying each other's company. Saturday morning, him and his cousins got up early, they went down to the docks, got in their canoes, and they spent the entire morning all the way until lunch fishing on the lake. Once lunchtime rolled around, they headed back to the docks, and they headed back up to Tim's cabin. So when they got up to the cabin, Tim headed inside for lunch, his cousins hopped on their bikes, they went back to their own cabins, and Tim for the rest of the afternoon basically just hung around his own cabin, played some video games until that evening. After dinner, his parents were going to be going over to one of his aunt and uncle's cabins, which was very typical of a weekend at the lake. Typically at the lake in the evenings, Tim's parents, along with his aunt and uncles, they would all go to one of the cabins. They would do some drinking, they'd play some cards, play some dice, play darts, and Tim and his cousins would get together. They would either go to one of the other cabins, play video games, or have a bonfire, or they would do what they loved to do at the cabin the most at night, which was jump on their bikes and basically just ride around the area in the dark. So that evening, when his parents headed over to his uncle's cabin, Tim linked up with his cousins and they kind of started talking about what they wanted to do. Tim's one cousin suggested that they have a fire and make some s'mores, but Tim and his other cousins, they were just not really feeling it that night. They really just kind of wanted to be out on their bikes. So Tim suggested that they ride to this small lake that was down this gravel road where they would go fishing during the day. Now, this lake was located several miles down this long gravel road, and the lake itself was not very big. It was loaded with lily pads, but they would go there quite often to go fishing during the day, but they had never been there at night, especially on their bikes. So the four of them, they got on their bikes and they started making their way out of the development up to this big, long gravel road. Once they got onto the gravel road, they turned and they started riding off down this dark road into the pitch blackness. They rode for quite a while down this road. It was about a 3-mile ride to this lake. And when they got to the lake, they had to turn off the gravel road and then go down this really rough, short gravel road. It wasn't even really a gravel road. It was kind of more like a dirt track. So they rode down this dirt track and they got to this small clearing that was right on the edge of this little lake. Once they were there, they kind of got off their bikes, walked up to the edge of the water, and they were kind of shining their flashlights down into the water, trying to see if they could see any fish swimming or any minnows or even crayfish. They stood there for a few minutes just kind of looking around at the water, and then all of a sudden across this part of the lake, which was only about 30 yards wide, they heard this loud crack coming from in the woods. The four of them instantly turned their flashlights towards where that sound came from, but they couldn't see anything at this point. After a few seconds, they kind of just went back to what they were doing. However, Tim's youngest cousin that was with them, who was about 12 years old, actually spoke up and said that he felt like something was just not right and that they needed to just get out of there and head back to the cabin. However, Tim and his other cousins ended up telling him, you know what, it's fine. Whatever made that noise is probably gone. It's most likely just an animal. We're good. However, about 30 seconds later, there was another loud crack coming from that same area. So again, just like the time before, all four of them got their flashlights up, started looking across the water. But again, they could not see anything just because the bush was so thick. At this point, all four of them started to think that that cracking was coming from a bull moose rubbing his horns up against a tree. And they started throwing rocks across that 30-yard gap into the woods on the other side. Now, Tim admits that that was incredibly stupid because that time of year, moose are in the rut, and a bull moose during the rut is typically the most dangerous animal in North America. They are incredibly aggressive. They've been known to charge at trains or semis that time of year, and because of their sheer size, which can be anywhere from about 1,500 up towards 2,000 pounds, and their aggression, you do not want to anger a bull moose during the rut. However, after throwing those rocks, those noises stopped. And again, his younger cousin said, guys, let's just get out of here. But again, Tim and his other cousins kind of tried to reassure the younger cousin that everything was fine. And they started to get back up towards the water again to continue off looking for fish and crayfish. When all of a sudden they heard something absolutely massive walking through the bush on the other side of the water. So again, they all got their flashlights up, they're looking across the water, but they're not seeing anything aside from the occasional branch of a tree move or the occasional bush shake. So they're looking across the water, trying to figure out what's walking through the bush there. And they start to kind of pick up that the footsteps that this thing is making as it's moving through the bush did not sound like a moose. It did not sound like a cervid. They did not hear the typical sounds of hooves on the ground and on the rocks. And the way that the footfalls were did not really sound right to them. Tim said that him and his cousins, as they were listening to this, he said it was almost like each one of them, within a couple of seconds, all of them said, that sounds like a person. It sounds like 2 feet walking through the bush. That does not sound like a moose or a deer. So the 4 of them kind of kept their flashlights shone in the direction of this thing moving through the bush. And they listened to it make its way about another 50 yards to where the lake kind of goes into a bay and starts to come back towards them. They listened to this thing make its way around part of that bay. And then all of a sudden, through the light of their flashlights, they saw this absolutely massive figure step out from behind this large pine tree. As soon as this thing stepped out, Tim said that he could tell if this thing was absolutely massive. He said it was about 9 to 9.5 feet tall and incredibly wide. He said he did not get a real good look at the facial features or any other features of this thing. But as soon as it stepped out from behind that tree, his younger cousin that entire time kept saying that he had a feeling like something wasn't right and that they had to get out of there, yelled, "It's a Bigfoot." As soon as his cousin yelled that, all 4 of them freaked out. They turned, ran back for their bikes, jumped on their bikes, and they started pedaling down that dirt track back up to the gravel road. As they were going down the dirt track, they could hear this Sasquatch running through the bush towards that gravel road as well. Once they hit the gravel road, they turned and they started pedaling like they had never pedaled before back towards their cabin. For about 300 yards, they can hear this thing running parallel to them along the side of this road. After about 300 yards, this thing started to kind of overtake them, started to pull up ahead of them through the bush. And then all of a sudden, right in front of them, standing in the middle of the gravel road, they saw that same massive silhouette standing right in the middle of the road. All 4 of them instantly hit their brakes and stopped, and they were just staring towards this thing. They were all freaking out at this point. They did not know what to do. They really had no choice but to continue going in that direction. If they went the other way, there was pretty much nothing that way for another 15 to 20 miles. So they knew there was no safety going that other direction and that they really had no choice but to keep going that way. So they just kind of stood there staring towards this thing, and all of a sudden it let out this blood-curdling scream. When it screamed, Tim said he felt like he was going to fall off his bike. He said he just wanted to curl up in the fetal position right there in the middle of the road. And he was really hoping that just at any moment he would wake up and this would just be a dream. So they just kind of stood there not knowing what to do. And this Sasquatch that just screamed at them started moving towards them. Tim said it took probably about 5 or 6 steps, stopped, and then it screamed at them again. And Tim figured at this point, for sure, this thing was just going to attack them. However, after it screamed that second time, it turned, walked back across the road into the bush towards that lake. As soon as it went into the bush, Tim and his cousins again started pedaling like they had never pedaled before. Tim said the rest of that ride, all the way back to his development, he said that was the most horrifying moment of his life, because he said he felt like at any point this thing was just going to come running out of the trees and that would be it for them. Tim's advice is, if you're ever out of the woods and you hear any type of sticks breaking or branches breaking, he said, even if you think it's a moose or a deer, he said, just try not to anger whatever's making that sound. He does not recommend ever trying to intimidate any animal. He said it doesn't matter what the animal is. He said you don't want to intimidate any animal and anger it. He said animals will react out of fear or out of anger very unpredictably. So he just recommends, if you hear anything, he said just kind of leave whatever's making that noise alone and don't try to anger them. Today I have a very interesting Sasquatch encounter that spans several years, all on the same property. But before we get into that encounter, welcome back to Dark Wilderness. If you've had an encounter that you would like to share on the show, please email me at the link below. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And since I'll be uploading multiple times every week, if you keep a donkey in with your cows, please have a mule kick that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. Today's encounter comes from a fellow that does not want me to use his real name, so we're just going to call him Kevin, and it takes place out in the RM of East Reynolds out in eastern Manitoba. Kevin in 2016 had retired from the railroad, and come 2017, him and his wife got to fulfill their lifelong retirement dream of buying a home in the country. So in early 2017, him and his wife, they sold their house in Winnipeg and they moved out to the RM of East Reynolds. The property they bought was absolutely massive. It was 800 acres, had a large country-style house with a beautiful wraparound porch. The property where they bought it also came with 25 head of cattle, a donkey, some chickens, various small farm equipment like a bobcat and a large ride-on lawnmower, and they could not be happier. Their property is located 3 miles off the highway down a very sparsely populated gravel road. On the one side of the road, they own 640 acres, which is where their house is, along with the majority of their cattle pastures. On the other side of the road, they own 160 acres as well. However, that 160 acres is pretty much just strictly bush. In July of 2017, when they moved in, they spent a couple of months just kind of learning the lay of the land, learning what's on their property, learning their cattle, basically just settling into country life. At the end of September, Kevin's buddy called him up and asked if they wanted to join him and his wife up at Hecla Island for the weekend. His buddy figured that the ladies could kind of spend the weekend kind of exploring around Hecla Village, and him and Kevin could get out of the boats and go after Lake Winnipeg greenbacks. Kevin was a very avid fisherman, so he jumped at the opportunity to go after these massive walleye. So on the Thursday evening, him and his wife loaded up in their car, made the drive out to Hecla. They spent the entire weekend just enjoying time with their friends, and then Sunday afternoon they made their way back to their house. When they got back to their property, they turned off the gravel road onto their driveway. Now their driveway runs for a quarter of a mile from the gravel road all the way to the house. So as they were going down their driveway, making their way up towards their house, they noticed on the left-hand side, where their main cattle pasture was, all of the cows, including their donkey, were all huddled together right up against the fence on the one side of that pasture. That instantly kind of set alarm bells off for Kevin because that was not like his donkey. Typically, if there's a predator, such as wolves or coyotes, cows will cluster together. However, the donkey that he keeps in there with him, like most cattle farmers, that donkey will go absolutely ballistic if there's any form of a predator like that in the area. So Kevin was instantly alerted to the fact that that was very strange behavior for his donkey. So when they got up to the house, he brought his bag in, told his wife that he was just going to go hop on the quad, drive through the pasture, just to kind of look around to see, if he saw any signs of any wolves or anything like that. So his wife started making dinner. He took off on his quad, started heading across the pasture. He spent about an hour and a half looking around for any signs of wolves or coyotes, and he couldn't find any sign at all. So he ended up making his way back to the house. Once he was inside, he called his neighbor from down the road, and he asked him if he had seen any wolf packs or any coyote packs over the last few days while he was gone. But his neighbor did not see anything, but his neighbor did mention to him that his cows were acting pretty weird the night before. He said that his cows were actually trying to push their way through one of his electric fences. So Kevin said that that was pretty odd. Him and his neighbor were kind of at a loss of why their cows were acting strange. But ultimately, they just brushed it off. Once Kevin got off the phone, him and his wife had dinner. After dinner, they went out onto their wraparound porch for a drink, and they were just sitting there enjoying each other's company in the night air. As they're sitting there, Kevin noticed that the motion light on his garage, which was located just to the right of where they were, had come on. So his attention kind of drew towards his garage, and when he turned his head, he noticed that there was this absolutely massive human-looking silhouette standing just inside the trees. He sat there for a second looking at this thing, recognizing that this thing was just absolutely massive. He couldn't make out any features of it, but he said this thing had to have been about 9 feet tall, and he just sat there looking directly at this thing, and then he tapped his wife beside him so she would look towards this thing as well. So now both of them are sitting there looking at this figure inside the trees, when all of a sudden it turns and it just walks off into the dark woods. His wife instantly stands up and says, "We have to go inside." So they both got up and they went directly into the house. When they got inside, Kevin looked at his wife and said, "You know what, honey, I think we might have just seen a Bigfoot." Now, both of them at this point were not scared. They're very open-minded people, but they were kind of trying to process exactly what they had seen and tried to figure out, if this was a Bigfoot that they had seen, or, maybe it was a trick of the light. So they kind of brushed it off, went off to bed. The next morning, Kevin got up, went outside, and he went directly over to his garage. He started looking around in the woods, trying to see any sign of what he had seen the night before. And over by the tree where this thing had been standing, he found a couple of large indents in the ground. And in that moment, it solidified everything for him. He knew 100% that they did not just make up what they saw. It was not a trick of the light, that there was something absolutely massive standing there the night before. After that, Kevin kind of developed a little bit of an addiction for a few weeks of going around his property, looking for any sign of the Sasquatch, or trying to even see another one of them. But the weather was getting colder, and Kevin knew that he had to move his cows from the one pasture over to the pasture that was closer to the house, because that's where the barn was and that's where the cows had to spend the winter. So it really forced him to abandon his search for this Bigfoot and kind of focus on everything that he needed to do to get ready for the winter coming up. So one day he went out into the woods to lay a temporary cattle fence in between those two pastures, just so that he wouldn't have to worry about any of the cows wandering away and having to chase him down. And while he was in there, he was securing the line to one of the posts. He heard this loud crack come from the woods behind him to his right. As soon as he heard that crack, he instantly reached to his shoulder to grab his rifle, which he had been carrying on him ever since the night that they had seen that figure. However, he did not have his rifle on him. It turned out that he actually left his rifle on the front of his quad, which was located about 150 yards away from him. So as soon as he reached for his rifle strap and realized he did not have his rifle, he started to get a little bit freaked out, but he turned and looked towards where that crack had come from, and standing about 35 yards away, kind of peeking from behind this large pine tree, he saw this large conular shaped head that was completely covered in hair just looking directly at him. He completely froze in that moment, just staring at this head that was just staring right back at him. And they looked at each other for about 30 seconds, and just like that night when him and his wife had seen the one standing in the bush, this one turned and just walked off into the woods. So Kevin instantly dropped his tools and he ran right back for his quad. He jumped on it and he booked it back for the house. Once he got inside, his wife could tell that he was really shaken up. And when he told her what happened, she was really shaken up as well. They ended up that night talking about potentially selling their place and moving to another area altogether. However, Kevin ended up telling his wife, this has been our dream all along. I don't want to give up on our dream just because of an animal. This thing has not shown any aggression towards us. I think we'll be okay as long as, we don't show aggression back to them. His wife decided, you know what, you might be right. We'll give it a chance. However, if these things start to show aggression, then we're going to sell. Kevin agreed fully with that. The next day, the two of them went out to the woods to go finish that temporary fence. They ended up getting their cattle moved into the other pasture. And throughout the winter, they did not have any more reoccurrences, no more sightings, nothing weird happening. However, in July of 2018, Kevin was out working in one of the pastures. His wife was doing some painting on the porch, when all of a sudden she heard this absolutely loud whistle come from over towards that cattle pasture. She instantly dropped what she was doing and focused all of her attention in that direction, trying to see if she would hear it again. When she did not hear it again, she thought, you know what, it was most likely just Kevin. He was probably whistling at the cows, trying to get their attention. So she went back to doing her painting. About a half hour later, Kevin came back to the house, and his wife asked him, why were you whistling at the cows? Kevin said, I wasn't with the cows, I was over at the barn. That kind of confused him for a few seconds, and then Kevin kind of started to think about it, and he said to his wife, you know what, I wonder if they're back. He said, we saw nothing or heard nothing over winter and into the spring, but I just cannot shake the feeling that this might be related. From that point on, every time Kevin went to go do any work around the property, he was always sure to carry his rifle on him. That fall, just before deer season, Kevin was out tending the fences along the one side of the property, when all of a sudden off in the woods he saw something lying on the ground. So he stepped up over the fence, made his way towards this thing that he saw on the ground, and as he got closer to it, he realized that it was the full skull of a really mature whitetail buck. So he stood there looking down at this thing, and he noticed that there were bone fragments kind of scattered all around the area. So he started walking around, just kind of looking down at the ground, checking out all these bone fragments. And he said that while he was on that side of the fence, he had this real strong feeling of not being wanted. And he said as he started to get further into the bush, tracking these bone fragments, all of a sudden he heard what sounded like somebody taking a baseball bat and just smoking the side of a tree. When he heard that, he instantly turned around, ran right back towards that fence, and as soon as he stepped over the fence to the other side, that feeling of not being wanted completely went away. A few weeks later, during the muzzleloader season, Kevin was out hunting deer on that side of the property when he saw a really nice buck jump that fence. So he figured, you know what, I'm going to see if I could stalk up on this buck, maybe get a shot at it. But as soon as he stepped over that fence, he was instantly hit with that feeling of not being wanted again. But this time he kind of brushed through it and continued to pursue this deer. He made it about 150 yards into the woods when all of a sudden something from in the woods screamed at him. As soon as he heard that, it shook him pretty bad, so he turned and he just ran right back towards that fence. And just like the time when he heard something hit that tree, as soon as he stepped over that fence, that feeling of not being wanted went away again. After that, Kevin kind of avoided going anywhere near that fence line until that winter. Just because once winter hit, he started to kind of think about the previous winter before where they had no weird things happen. They didn't hear or see anything. So at this point, he was starting to think that, maybe these things were migrating. Maybe they only kind of came to his property, late summer and into the fall. So that winter, he tried to put that to the test. He said he knew he was pressing his luck by doing this. But in February, he went out to that fence line, stepped over the fence, did not feel that feeling of not being wanted. And he said he walked probably about 500-600 yards into the woods. And he didn't have that feeling the entire time he was in there. So he just came right back out. And he decided from that point on that, you know what? Summer and fall, I'm not going on this side of the fence. Winter, if I have to, I will. But other than that, I'm not going to step over this fence anymore. And then the next year in 2020, that summer went pretty smoothly for him and his wife. They heard a couple of those whistles throughout the summer, but they did not see anything. They had nothing else happen. However, one evening that fall, Kevin was working on winterizing his boat when all of a sudden he was hit with an absolutely putrid smell of what he described as rotten garbage. It was so bad that it made him start to cough, so he had to stand up, and as soon as he stood up, he could see over his boat, standing along the bush line no more than 15 yards away from him, was this absolutely massive 9.5 to 10 foot tall Sasquatch just staring right back at him. Kevin completely froze in this moment, just staring back at this thing. And after a few seconds, this Sasquatch took a step back into the bush and then just disappeared into the darkness. Kevin instantly went into the house and told his wife what had just happened. And again, they talked about potentially selling their property. However, after talking for a little while, again, they both agreed that, you know what, as long as they're not showing any form of aggression, we'll stay. But if they start to show aggression, then we're going to sell. That winter, just like the winter before and just like the one before that, they saw and heard absolutely nothing. Come the spring, they had still had no more activity. But come summer, Kevin had to do a lot of fence repairs along that fence line. There was quite a bit of snow and it had dropped quite a few tree branches that had damaged that barbed wire fence. So he had to spend quite a bit of time working on that fence that summer. And he said that every time he would step over that fence, if he got more than just a few feet away from it, he would instantly be hit with that unwanted feeling again. So he really tried to limit the amount of time he spent on that side of the fence. Come that fall, a good friend of his had actually asked him if it would be all right if he came hunting out there for the deer season. Kevin figured, you know what, yeah, that's fine. But he told him, you know what, you can hunt the property, that's not a problem. But under no circumstance do you go on the other side of this fence onto this other portion of the property. His friend agreed to that, thought that was fair. So his friend came out for the archery season and into muzzle loading. Come the rifle season, he got a call from his friend, and his friend was asking if it would be okay if he brought one of his buddies out with him. Kevin thought, you know what, my buddy's been pretty good at following the only rule I have on the property. You know what, yeah, that's not a problem. So he told his friend, yeah, you can bring your buddy, just remember, don't go on that side of the property. His buddy said, yeah, I'll let him know. On the first Saturday of the rifle season, his buddy had brought his friend out for the day. Kevin met up with him in the morning, kind of shared a little bit of intel with them on where the big bucks were, and kind of reminded him of that only rule, which was not to hunt on that side of the property. Later on in the day, Kevin was out working by the barn when all of a sudden he heard two shots come from over towards that fence line. Kevin was instantly ticked off because he had told them that morning not to be on that side of the property. But he figured, you know what, he would just deal with it at the end of the day when they were making their way out. So come the end of the day, once it was dark, he saw his buddy's truck kind of making its way across that cattle pasture, and he went up to confront them. When he got up to the truck, first thing he noticed was that there were no deer in the back of the truck. So he kind of brought up the fact that he heard these two shots come from over towards that fence line. And it turned out that his buddy's friend had actually said he took a couple of shots at a deer, but that he had missed and he wasn't able to find it. Kevin kind of got a little bit of a weird feeling from his buddy's friend that this guy was not really telling him the exact truth. So the next morning, Kevin got up, hopped on his quad, and he made his way over to that fence line. As he was driving the quad down the fence line, he saw some boot prints in the very limited amount of snow that was on the ground going over that fence. So he stopped his quad, kind of stepped over the fence, feeling very on edge because of every single time that he's crossed that fence, getting hit with that feeling. But he really wanted to see where those boot prints went. So he made his way through the bush following those boot prints. And about 75 yards from the fence line, he saw lying on the ground right in front of him was a dead spike buck with boot prints going all the way around it. Kevin was instantly absolutely enraged by this because now not only did that mean that either his buddy or his buddy's friend had been hunting on the side of the property where he said they were not supposed to be hunting, but this also meant that they had shot a deer and then just left it there for no reason. So Kevin, feeling absolutely enraged at this point, turned around and he started making his way back towards his quad. He said as he was making his way back towards that fence line, he was hit with an absolutely overpowering feeling of dread. He said the typical feeling on that side of the fence line was always one of not being wanted, never a feeling like this. He said this feeling was like a absolute like get out of here now or something bad's going to happen type feeling. So he quickly made his way to the fence, hopped over it, got on the quad, and went back to the house. He ended up calling his buddy later that day to ask him who shot this deer, why they were on that side of the property, and it turned out that his buddy that had been hunting with him was a very inexperienced hunter, and the guy was not very ethical. He ended up shooting this spike buck thinking it was a doe, and then he just left it there because he did not want to use his general tag on it. So Kevin was instantly even more infuriated at this, so he ended up telling his buddy, that's it, no more hunting on my property, that's done. That night when Kevin and his wife were getting ready for bed, they were already lying down, just getting ready to fall asleep, when all of a sudden they heard footsteps coming along their wraparound porch. They could tell that these footsteps were incredibly heavy, and they knew instantly what was walking on their porch. Both of them just lied there in bed, absolutely horrified at this point, as these footsteps came closer and closer towards where their sliding glass doors were in their bedroom. As these footsteps got closer, all of a sudden they were able to make out this dark silhouette right through their doors. And this figure stood there right in front of their doors of their bedroom for a good solid minute while Kevin and his wife were absolutely petrified lying in their bed. This figure all of a sudden let out this really deep grunt, and then it turned and they heard it walk off the porch and they heard it disappear off into the woods. At that point, they were both pretty much just ready to sell and just get out of there. However, after they started kind of talking about it a little bit, they started to think, you know what, we've been dealing with these things for 3 years now. This is the first time anything like this has happened. You know, we love our home, we love our property, and they decided they were not going to leave unless they were forced out of there. They kind of looked at that situation of that Sasquatch coming right up to the house as kind of a warning because of what happened with that deer. After that winter, they had no more activity around the house, nothing in the spring again as well. That summer, Kevin went out and bought a whole bunch of trail cameras. He set them up all over the property, not only in hopes to try to get a picture of one of these things, but also he had read up that they could detect the infrared from trail cameras. So he figured if he put a whole bunch of these all around his house, that maybe that would stop one of these things from coming up to the house again. Now, ever since then, they have not seen any more Sasquatches on their property. They do hear the occasional whistle. Kevin said that when he goes along that fence line, if he gets too close towards that fence line, he starts to really feel unwanted. He said the odd time that he has had to go on the other side, he said as soon as he steps over the fence, he is hit with that feeling of dread again. He thinks that initially these Sasquatch were just very curious about him and his wife, and he thinks that the first few years that they were on their property, that there was a little bit of a mutual trust between them, that he would not go into their area and they would stay away from his house. And he feels like the reason that that one came right up to his house was because of that incident with the deer. Ever since then, he considers that one side of his property their property, especially summer and fall. He'll only go onto that side of the property to work on that fence line if absolutely necessary, and he'll try to avoid doing it during the summer and the fall. Kevin's advice is just always pay attention to the warning signs. He said if one of these things are in the area and it does not want you there, that it will let you know. He said if you do experience those warning signs, just turn around and get out of there. Just leave them alone. He said you do not want to anger one of these things. Today's episode is going to be one of my personal experiences while out deer hunting in 2008. But before we get into that story, welcome back to Dark Wilderness. If you've had an encounter that you would like to share on the show, please email me at the link below. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And next time you're heading off in the woods to go deer hunting, don't forget to slam that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. I've been receiving a lot of emails lately asking if I've ever had anything creepy happen to me while I've been out hunting or out in the woods. Now, I did do an episode right when I first started this channel about some eyes that me and my cousin saw a couple of years ago, and that we had something follow us through the bush all the way back to our vehicle, more or less. However, that's not the only creepy thing that's ever happened to me while I've been out in the bush. I've been charged by bears twice over the last 4 years. The first time was during an archery season. I was tracking a doe, and as I was tracking her through the bush, I heard something off to my left, kind of turned my head, and I had 2 bear cubs running directly towards me. As soon as I went to stand up, all of a sudden the mama bear came running up from behind the cubs and just beelined directly towards me. I got up, whipped out my bear spray. Luckily, this bear stopped about 15 yards from me, had her paws up on a tree, and she was just making all kinds of disgusting sounds. Luckily, my buddy that was with me, he had his 12 gauge. However, he was about 75 yards away. I just yelled over to him to fire a shot. He ended up shooting into a tree, and the mom and the cubs ended up taking off. 2 years later, I was out by Rennie, Manitoba. I was out muzzleloading with my cousin John and my cousin Dave, and I was sitting up on top this little ridge in this clearing. And I just finished doing a rattle sequence and a grunt call, and also I could hear something coming down the ridge on the other side. Thinking it was a buck, I started to get a little bit excited. Then all of a sudden I realized that this was not a buck. It was actually a massive male black bear, and he came walking directly towards me. So I stood up. I was kind of at the top of an incline with about a 15-foot drop. However, just off to my left, the ridge kind of sloped down gradually. As soon as I stood up, that bear just absolutely got ticked off. He beelined directly towards the ridge that I was standing on. I ended up yelling at him. He stopped, started huffing and kind of smacking the ground. Then I yelled at him again and he took off. But I did have one encounter back in 2008. Now, everybody knows I'm a very avid deer hunter, and most people by now do know that I served in the Canadian Forces. I was actually a reservist for 14 years. I was a combat engineer. And in 2008, I spent 3 months out in Wainwright, Alberta. I was out there assisting with pre-deployment training for the troops that were going to be deploying to Afghanistan. I had left in August, and I got back just before the start of rifle whitetail season here in Manitoba, which generally starts about the second week in November. So right when I got back, my dad and my uncles and all my cousins, everybody was getting ready to go on our annual family deer hunting trip. The place that we always hunt as a family is located right by the Manitoba Saskatchewan border. It's actually about 20 minutes north of a town called Elkhorn. Now, typically we stay in Elkhorn. On the property that we hunt, though, my uncle did have a trailer, and him and my other uncle would always camp on the property, and the rest of us all stayed at this hotel. Now, I grew up hunting this property. It's absolutely massive. It's owned by a family friend, and we actually had permission on a couple of the neighboring properties as well. So the area is absolutely huge. I know it incredibly well just because I grew up hunting this place. Now, when I go hunting out to this particular property, because there's so many of us in our group and there's another group that hunts out there as well, I typically try to stay pretty far away from everybody. The closest person to me generally at most times is usually my dad. And back in 2008, where he would set his tree stand up from where I had my stands, as a crow would fly would be about a kilometer away. That just kind of gives you a little bit of a taste of really how far I tend to kind of stay away from other hunters while I'm out hunting. Now that's just where our tree stands are located. We also usually set up quite a few pop-up blinds. We'll set them up at different parts of the property just to give ourselves more options on places to hunt. That afternoon though, me and my cousin, we had gone for a walk. We actually walked down this really long cut line. It runs about a half a mile, maybe a little bit more. And then it kind of ends at another cut line that runs north-south. And right where the two cut lines kind of meet, there was this old quad trail that kind of made its way through the woods towards the Assiniboine Valley. And I had never gone in there before, so we took a walk in there, and it looked really promising. So I decided that night that's where I was going to go sit. So that night I was sitting on this cut line. My cousin was sitting on the cut line that ran north-south, and he was probably about 700 yards away from me. While I was sitting there the entire evening, there was no sounds at all. I did not hear any birds. I didn't see any squirrels. Normally I'll have squirrels barking at me like crazy. I don't know if I draw them in or what, but I always just have tons of squirrels yelling at me all the time. However, I had nothing like that going on that night. Saw no deer or no nothing. I was just sitting there though, just relaxing because of the past 3 months were just absolutely hectic being out in Wainwright. I was just enjoying actually not having to do army stuff for once because it was just absolute hell that 3 months I was gone. So I was sat there, and right before dark I decided, it's about 3-4 minutes left of legal light, I decided, you know what, that's it, I'm just going to pack up my stuff. So I stood up, and right when I stood up I was looking directly down this quad trail. And all of a sudden, about 150 yards away, all of a sudden something really large and dark crossed that cut line. Now, it crossed it on 2 legs, and it crossed it pretty easily. It was only a couple of steps, and it was across this trail. Now, that trail was actually fairly wide at this point, because where I had set up, the trail kind of ran and went into a little bit of a clearing. So it went from only being maybe, 8 feet wide to probably about 15, 16 feet wide. So this thing crossed that wider section of this trail on 2 legs. When I saw it, I kind of went into a little bit of an army mode, even though I wasn't 100% sure what I had just seen. But as soon as it crossed, I got my weapon up, and I actually started walking backwards down the quad trail with my weapon at the high ready. Once I got to a part of the trail where the trail kind of turned, kind of dipped my weapon down, and I just ended up running all the way to that other cut line, linked up with my cousin. Then we ended up walking over towards where my dad's truck was. When we linked up with the rest of the family, I actually told the entire story to one of my family members, and he said never to talk about it. He said don't ever bring it up. He said people just think you're nuts. He himself had actually had a Sasquatch encounter quite a few years prior. He was out fishing, and he actually had one come walking out of the bush. Now, what I remember the most about that evening, aside from the fact that something absolutely massive crossed that trail in front of me, was really how I felt in that moment. I would not call it a feeling of dread. It was kind of more of a overwhelming feeling of I need to get out of here, and I need to get out of here now. That's what kind of triggered my response with me getting my weapon up and kind of doing a tactical withdrawal out of there. Now, I've never had that exact feeling ever again. Even that time that me and my cousin saw those eyes in the bush, the feeling was different. I've had two bears charge me over the last 4 years. I come across wolves all the time. I actually have zero fear of wolves whatsoever. I've come across cougars. I've actually had two wolves fight right underneath my stand, and I've never had that feeling again. I've had some weird feelings while being out of the bush, but never anything at that level. This whole experience was really what got me involved with this topic. It really got me into listening to different stories, looking up different encounters, watching different documentaries. Now, I would not consider myself an investigator. I would not go out looking for these things. And I would really kind of advise other people not to go looking for these things as well, just because of all the different encounters that I've been shared. They're not always, the real peaceful type where you just kind of catch a glimpse of one walking across something or just kind of peeking behind a bush. These things can and do get very aggressive. Now, I have never had anything like that happen since. I've never had that exact feeling, and I'm out of the bush all the time. My advice is really, whenever you go out in the bush, just always keep your head on a swivel. Just always kind of really pay attention to everything around you. As I said, I was in the Canadian Forces for 14 years, and I've been a hunter all my life, and I was very at home in the woods. And I think, honestly, that military training and just all the experience from hunting is kind of what kept me more calm than most people in that situation. Some other people might have locked up or might have just tried to run away and kind of taken their eyes off of the direction where that thing had crossed. I don't know what would have happened if I would have turned and ran. I don't know what would have happened if I just froze and stayed still. But again, just always really be aware of your surroundings. Pay attention to your gut. If you start to feel like something's off, just kind of turn around and walk out on the same path that you came in on. And if you do happen to come across anything, just try not to really provoke it into anything more than what it really needs to be at that time. Well, that's it for today's story. As always, thanks for joining us. And if you have any comments, please leave them in the comments below. And if you haven't done so already, please slam that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.